Our next speaker is an advocate of children's rights and environmental protection. He finished Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering at the Manuel L. Quezon University and Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Sanitary Engineering at the National University. He also took several units on Masters of Science in Environment and Natural Resources Management at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Some of the trainings and courses he completed both local and international levels include topics project management, occupational health and safety, behavior change communication, disaster risk reduction and management, and climate change, cluster coordination, and emergency response. He has 12 years of experience in designing and managing programs on water, sanitation, and hygiene, environmental health and school health and nutrition, and integrating disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation. His role as technical advisor in Save the Children Philippines gave him the opportunity to work with various stakeholders both at national and sub-national levels, which allowed him to contribute in the development and implementation of national policies such as on water, sanitation, and hygiene in schools and in emergencies. He is also an advocate of menstrual hygiene management amongst girls' school children and contributed to studies, evaluation tools, and learning materials on the topic. He was also part of delivering trainings, local government units, educators, health personnel, and teachers on managing school programs, disaster preparedness, and emergency response, health, nutrition, and hygiene promotion and education, and has contributed in the development of various learning resources. Currently, he supports programs that strengthens climate resistance and promotes environmental sustainability in schools and community settings. Let us all welcome Engineer Jonathan C. Valdez.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Manuel L. Quezon University, Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers Student Chapter, and also the Faculty of Engineering. I would like to thank you for this opportunity of being able to be a guest speaker to your General Assembly, and I would like to really express my sincere thanks and also my gratitude for being able to have the opportunity to share my experience and knowledge around the topic on climate change and disaster reduction in the Philippine context. So this morning, I would like to give you a background on climate change and disaster reduction concepts. And also we will be discussing what is climate change and how it impacts us as individuals, our communities, our families, and also our environment as well. We will also be touching legal frameworks on climate change and disaster reduction in the Philippines. And later on in my presentation, I will discuss what would be some of the interventions that we will be able to do, us being engineers or you as future engineers, in terms of climate change and disaster reduction. Now, for some of concepts on climate change and disaster reduction. First, climate change. So what is climate change? Climate change is defined as a systematic change in the long-term state of the atmosphere over multiple decades or longer. So we all know that over a period of years, like for example, 30 to 50 years, there will be natural climate variabilities that we will be monitoring or experiencing, particularly our climate scientists. But climate change, however, is being monitored in longer periods of time. So longer than decades, it could be a century. Later on, I'll show you some data on in terms of how our climate scientists were able to monitor the changes in climate patterns, and also how these potential changes or evidences in terms of change in climate will have an impact on our environment and our communities. So disasters, on the other hand, are serious disruptions of the functioning of a community or a society, So when we speak of disasters, these are brought up by hazardous events, and there are conditions that should be in place for us to say that the disaster and its impact is really, really high or huge. So these are our exposure, particularly to the hazards or risk of being exposed to hazards, our individual vulnerability or our community's vulnerability, and our capacity to absorb these shocks and stresses brought about by disasters or hazardous events. Now, disaster risk is the potential loss of life, injury, or destruction of properties or assets. So when there is a disaster and there is a high exposure and high vulnerability and low capacity, we will be able to experience higher disaster risk. Higher exposure and higher vulnerability means might expect probabilities of more destruction of properties, disruption of systems or services, and in extreme conditions, the loss of lives. Disaster reduction, however, is for us to reduce disaster risk through efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters. So these causal factors include, as I mentioned earlier, exposure to hazards, the vulnerability, and also our interventions in terms of the management of land and the environment, and our preparedness, disaster preparedness, and our response capacity. On the other hand, climate change adaptation is adjusting to current or expected climate change and its potential effects. In most of the literatures and also in the trainings and capacity building that I've been to, disaster reduction and climate change adaptation are being linked together because these two are actually have similarities in terms of the interventions that we need to do to be able to adapt to or mitigate or prevent disasters or disaster risk to happen. So later on, I will show you some of the perspectives in terms of how we will be able to contribute as engineers. Climate change mitigation, on the other hand, is for us to reduce or prevent emissions of greenhouse gases. So in the next slides, we will be able to identify briefly what are these greenhouse gases and how it impacts climate change. So what is climate change? So in this slide, this just shows a diagram of our climate system. So as I mentioned earlier, so climate varies and it's also being monitored in terms of variability over a period of time. Climate system is influenced by many factors. So in the diagram, for example, you see that atmospheric conditions, hydrological cycles, changes in solar inputs, also the interactions within the hydrosphere, in the cryosphere, and also human activities or influences. These are all factors when it comes to how our climate system works. So when we say system, all of these factors or components or variables should interact together or interact to be able to affect the whole system. So one changes in one of the component affects the whole system. So it's a chain effect. So what is climate change? So what causes climate change? So mainly within our atmosphere, when the solar radiation enters into our atmosphere, some of the solar radiation is being reflected by the Earth and the atmosphere, but some of it also stays within the atmosphere, but it's being distributed or dissipated, or some of these are absorbed within the atmosphere. Now, with climate change is seen to be a imbalance, or mainly climate change is caused mainly by the imbalance in the Earth's energy. So when we say imbalance, for example, when the solar radiation enters into our climate system and into our atmosphere, so the greenhouse gases that are existing within the atmosphere, uh, these gases traps too much heat and energy within the atmosphere, increasing the Earth's temperature outside of the range of natural variability. So in our when we were in high school or maybe in elementary, we've been hearing about this greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is actually trapping the solar radiation that goes into our planet. So these greenhouse gases are actually carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and other greenhouse gases. So these greenhouse gases, or these gases, are actually mostly existing in our atmosphere. But due to human interventions or human activities actually produce a lot of these greenhouse gases or emissions, more than what we should have in the atmosphere. So in this slide that you're looking at, we can see that carbon dioxide is actually the highest greenhouse gases that human activities emit or produce. So most of the carbon dioxide that we have in the atmosphere comes from transportation, coal and crude oil, and fossil fuel combustion. So power plant operations, coal-fired power plants, uh, non-fuel efficient cars, and also transportation systems that creates a lot of congestion and issues on traffic and mobility, and also the use of fossil fuels, coal and crude oil. So the next greenhouse gas that actually being emitted is methane. So most of the methane emissions comes from natural gas systems, landfills. The reason why we've been uh, saying that landfills are actually last resort. So like for example, in the Philippines, our law, RA 9003, or the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, really promotes reduction of waste, recycling, and reuse. So landfills are actually last resort, and based on our law and in practice, what goes into the landfills are actually residual waste. So meaning these are non-recyclable, these are waste that could not be reused, or most probably not being reused, or they are not anymore could be upcycled or converted into something useful. And also in agriculture, particularly in production of meat and other livestock. Now, what are the impacts of climate change? Before we discuss the impacts, I would like to present to you what are the hazard classifications we have so far. So you have seven actually. You have seven hazard classifications, but in this diagram, we will only be showing 6 classifications. So the first one is geophysical. So something related to earthquake, mass movement, and also volcanic activity. Hydrological hazards, which are flood, landslide, wave action. Meteorological hazards, storm, extreme temperature, fog, climatological hazards, drought, glacial lake outbursts, wildfire. Biological, such as animal accident, epidemic, insect infestation, extraterrestrial hazards such as impact and space weather. So in terms of climate change, we will be linking climate change mostly with hydrological hazards, meteorological hazards, and climatological hazards. So when we have climate change, it affects our ecosystem. Primarily, there will be change in rain and snow patterns, change in animal migration and life cycles, stronger storms, high temperatures, and more heat waves, particularly in urban centers where there is high congestion, a lot of infrastructure that actually absorbs heat. So more droughts and wildfires, less snow and ice, permafrost, changes in plant life cycles, warmer oceans, rising sea level, and damaged corals. So even though, for example, in the Philippines, we don't have snow or ice, we don't have snow patterns, we don't experience that, we don't experience drastic wildfires, although drought is actually an effect of climate change here in our country. Melting of ice and snow patterns will still affect us even though we don't experience this. So for example, melting of ice would result into rise in sea level, and also the warmer oceans and damage in coral reefs will also affect us, especially that the Philippines is actually highly relying also on marine resources. So all of these impacts of climate change has an effect on the Philippines. Either one of these or a couple of these. And in the succeeding slides, we will discuss in detail what would be these impacts of climate change. So in a report of the United Nations in 2020, there are a couple of reports that were featured that shows how drastic climate change has been and what its potential impacts are. So for example, in a report of the United in Science 2020 report, it is projected that by 2050, the number of people at risk of floods will increase from its current level of 1.2 billion to 1.6 billion. And as we all know, the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable to floods in relation to climate change. There was also a report in 2019 by IPCC, which recorded that 2019 is actually the second hottest year on record, which is 1.1 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 recordings. So it is projected that with the current path of our carbon dioxide emissions or CO2 emissions, it is expected that the temperature would increase by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So imagine a 1 degree or 1.1 degrees Celsius increase already has an effect on climate. So imagine a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius increase on what would be its potential impacts. So in 2018, there was also a report that in terms of the levels of greenhouse gases that is being trapped in the atmosphere, in 2018 there was a record high of 407.8 parts per million, according to the World Meteorological Organization Greenhouse Gas Bulletin. And also, there was a report by UNEP emission gas report that global greenhouse gas emissions needed to fall by 7.6% each year over the next decade to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So why did they say that we will only be able to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius? Because on the previous reports, it has been projected already that there is a definite increase of 1.515 degrees Celsius in the coming years. So it cannot be prevented, and that's a reality. And these are really driven by human activities. So climate change is a reality, and that's why this discussion is really timely for us to really tackle the realities of what will be its potential impacts. So in the diagram, these are the summary of several reports that I've mentioned earlier, and we can also provide you with the sources of these reports. So specifically on the WMO or the World Meteorological Organization's report, which they have a state of climate in 2018 presented, they really mentioned that there's really an accelerating climate change impacts. So for example, from different sources, 35 more than 35 million people has been affected by floods. There is still an ongoing ocean acidification. Climate change particularly threatens peatland ecosystems. There has been recorded more than 1,600 deaths, which are associated with heat waves and wildfires. There has been massive displacements in the past years, and 32% of these displacements are linked to floods and 29% to droughts. There is also a decrease in global ocean oxygen, which affects marine life. And in one report, there are also more than 2 million people displaced by weather and climate linked disasters. Lastly, there will be an estimated 821 million undernourished individuals, particularly majority of these are children due to drought. So when we all know that when there is drought, it affects food security and food production. It was also recorded by one of the sources of data that we have in terms of disaster monitoring that over a period of 1980 to 2011, there were already 3,455 floods, 2,689 storms, 470 droughts, and 395 extreme temperatures globally. So in the Philippines, we are actually ranked 9th currently among the 180 countries at risk of disasters as a consequence of extreme natural events. So this is according to the World Risk Index in 2019. And also in the Global Climate Index, Risk Index in 2020, the Philippines is the 5th most vulnerable to climate change. The Philippines is also at risk to 3 weather-related hazards, particularly relating to mortality or the deaths due to these hazards and damages to property. So tropical cyclones, floods, and landslides. So in the Philippines, on an average, we have around 22 to 25 typhoons that visits the Philippines in a year, and the probability is 5 of these typhoons are really destructive. So for example, in 2020, we can all recall that around three typhoons passed the Philippines, and the destruction in terms of property and loss of lives has been significant. So there was also a study conducted by the Asian Development Bank in 2017 that looked at the impacts of climate change in Asian countries. So with this report, it is projected that the Asian landmass, including here is the Philippines, will experience a 6 degrees Celsius rise in temperature by the end of the century. So this is actually this actually validates the earlier report I've said that there will be a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature by the end of the century in one of the UN reports. And in the Philippines, unfortunately, there are 25 cities at risk of rising sea levels due to the impacts of climate change. So 7 out of these 25 cities are at risk. And if I may recall it correctly, some of the cities are located in Metro Manila, particularly the cities that are low-lying, or these are flood-prone cities. It is also predicted that in the coming years, there will be heavier rains, which would result into severe flooding. There will also be longer droughts, particularly in the southern part of the Philippines. So there will be really drastic changes in weather patterns and also in climate in general. And the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable to these impacts. So working with children, I would like also to emphasize how children are or will potentially be impacted by climate change. So primarily, having no climate protection or the absence of interventions or measures that would prevent or mitigate the impacts of climate change and also disasters would mean that we are actually violating children's rights. Although generally there will be impacts to individuals, we all know that children are amongst the most vulnerable in terms of the impacts of climate change. So among these negative effects that we will be anticipating is that climate change would threaten the economy, global water supply, agricultural resources, ecosystems, health, and forestry. And all of these resources that we have has an impact to the rights of children to life, health, and decent living conditions. It also affects their right to education, affects the long-term protection of ethnic minorities. So in the Philippines, our children now and our children in the coming years would be the ones who will bear the impacts of climate change. So now we go to the legal frameworks on climate change in DRR in the Philippines. So there are several laws and policies that are already in place in terms of disaster reduction management, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. But basically, you have the local government code, which states that the local government units has the primary responsibility to provide direct response to disasters. This includes also disasters that are effects of climate change. The second one is the Philippine Disaster Reduction and Management Act, which is actually called RA 10121. So this Disaster Reduction Management Act is actually promoting a more proactive management to disaster risk. So it's an coordinated and integrated approach to strengthening the capacity of families, individuals, and communities to absorb the stresses and maintain basic functions during emergencies and disasters. So in the Philippines, we also adopted the cluster approach. So there are different clusters within the governments. And in terms of disaster reduction, we also adopt a framework in terms of disaster risk reduction and management. We also have the National Framework Strategy on Climate Change. So this framework envisions a climate risk resilient Philippines with healthy, safe, prosperous, and self-reliant communities and thriving and productive ecosystems. So this national framework is supposed to be updated this 2022, and its goal is to build up the adaptive capacity of communities and increase resilience. So from this framework, the National Climate Change Commission developed a National Climate Change Action Plan for 2011 to 2018. So this action plan prioritizes food security, water sufficiency, ecosystem and environmental stability, human security, climate smart industries and services, sustainable energy, and capacity development. So in our profession as engineers, especially when you students graduate, there's a high possibility that once you enter into the industry, whether it's private or public, and as I mentioned, climate change affects everyone, you will be able to contribute in each of the priorities of our climate change action plan. So there's also a National Disaster Reduction and Management Plan, which is actually an output out of the our DRRM Act or RA 10121. So the NDRM Plan actually has comprised of disaster prevention and mitigation, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and disaster rehabilitation and recovery. So in our context, we are more into disaster prevention and mitigation and disaster preparedness. Although, like for example, in my case, I've been involved in disaster response, rehabilitation, and recovery for almost a decade now. So this is just to put in detail what each of the components or themes of the disaster reduction and management plan comprise of. And there's also a recently passed law, which is RA 10821, or it's a comprehensive emergency program for children which is a product of this Republic Act. And specifically, this Republic Act focuses on the protection or provision of services to children during the times of calamities or in any emergency situations. So with all of these frameworks, the context of climate change, how it will impact the Philippines us individually. So what would be our role? What would be our potential role in terms of disaster reduction, climate change adaptation, and mitigation? So this diagram just shows what are the key elements in terms of disaster reduction and management. So I've defined earlier that you have several hazards. In our presentation, we presented 6 hazards, and these hazards would become disasters, and a disaster in terms of risk and its impact is driven by our vulnerability and exposure. So in this diagram, as you can see, the individuals, or we can say a family downhill, is actually highly exposed to the hazard, which is the rock, and their vulnerability is high because there is no barrier. The rock can easily roll down the hill, and would hit them. So once the rock rolls down the hill and it hits the family, so this is a what we call a disaster in this diagram. But in terms of interventions, we can either prevent, mitigate, or prepare for this disaster before it happens. So in the succeeding slides, I will show you some interventions in terms of engineering that we can see ourselves contributing to once you graduate and practice your profession. So in disaster prevention, some of the examples are construction of infrastructures that would eliminate the risk. So for example, if an area is a highly vulnerable to flood hazards or flooding, one of the interventions that we do is we construct dams or embankments. Also, we can also implement properly land use regulations. So like in the Philippines, we already have areas that are declared no-build zones. We are now identifying hazard-prone areas through hazard maps that we have. And we are also implementing no-build zones into areas that are flood-prone. And we have been implementing also strictly implementing easements when it comes to communities or residential areas that are also near bodies of water. Another prevention measure that we can do is how we are doing our engineering designs. So this one, engineering designs, we should ensure structural integrity, survival and function of buildings and other infrastructures in any likely disaster such as earthquake and typhoons. So as of now, maybe some of you have been using structural codes or building designs and standards or building codes. So once you practice your profession, in terms of prevention, these are actually what we can contribute largely in terms of ensuring that our buildings are safe and structurally sound. And they are really, really designed and constructed with quality. In terms of disaster mitigation, we can use hazard maps to aid our designs and planning. So for example, hazard maps would tell you that this area is flood prone, so you can design your structure or maybe don't build at the area or site at all. Your soil testing would also tell you how vulnerable the area is in terms of soil saturation. So hazard maps are a very useful tool when it comes to design and planning for your projects. So again, adoption and enforcement of land use and zoning practices. So these are really, really essential, and hazard maps would aid this decision-making process. And lastly, that's something related with the earlier prevention measures is how do you enforce building codes? For example, if from approval of plans and building permits, in terms of monitoring the construction, if it meets the construction standards and there is no discrepancy in terms of the specification or the quality of materials that is supposedly being used in the structure. So these are all factors that affects how we implement our building codes and standards. In terms of climate change adaptation, there are several interventions that we can contribute to. one of which is the efficient use of water resources. So some of you, you may enter into water resource management. Some of you might do environmental management, become environmental planners or urban planners. So one factor that you would be interested to look at is how you will be able to efficiently use water resource. And also in terms of climate adaptation, we all know that the rise in global temperature will happen, and it has happened, and it's predicted to increase further. We cannot prevent it, but we can slow it down. But as of now, I think we need to really look at how we will be able to adapt our building codes when it comes to the predicted climate conditions and extreme weather events that we will experience in the coming years or decades. Also, when it comes to adaptation, we all know that there will be rise in sea level and there will be more areas that are flood prone, or they are already vulnerable to flooding and typhoon. So flood defenses and adjusting infrastructures to anticipate the flood conditions would be an intervention that we can look at in terms of climate change adaptation. And also, it's also being a practice now here in the Philippines. We are looking at climate resilient designs of house and buildings. The climate resilient designs also has components of proper design in terms of structures, specification of materials, and following building codes and standards. So as you can see, disaster risk prevention, mitigation, and climate change adaptation are actually interlinked or linked to each other. So they are closely related when it comes to planning for interventions that we can do in terms of DRR and climate change. So the last one is around climate change mitigation. So this merely is around prevention or minimizing the emission of greenhouse gases. So individually, as a family, as a community, as a society, we can actually contribute in terms of climate change mitigation. But for engineering, as engineers, I would suggest that we look at the energy efficiency of our buildings. So when we design buildings or upgrade them, let us ensure that they will be energy efficient. So currently, I think we have a sort of a certification or a program in terms of green building certification. So that initiative is actually really a good initiative when it comes to climate change mitigation. Another one is the utilization of clean and renewable energy. So solar, hydroelectric, thermal, particularly solar energy, which is something that we can harvest being in a tropical country. So renewable energy has a huge potential in the Philippines. So maybe some of you would be entering into energy generation once you practice or you enter into the job market. Then consider looking at renewable and clean energy as an option. And the last one is looking at sustainable transportation and effective transport system. So you're looking at fuel efficient transportation system, fuel efficient cars. They are actually maintained well, so that they will not emit greenhouse gases more than what they should be emitting. We all know that vehicles are actually emitting greenhouse gases. So we wanted to minimize or limit the emission by making them more fuel efficient and also adhere to environmental standards. And I think individually, among this mitigation, prevention, and adaptation, individually we can do something. So before I end my presentation, I would like to read to you this statement or quote made by Greta Thunberg. So if some of you don't know Greta Thunberg, so Greta Thunberg is actually one of the youth advocates, or if I may use the term activists when it comes to climate change. So she uh, she actually started the climate strike, Friday climate strike. So every Friday, uh, she doesn't attend her school, and she protests related to climate change. So one of her statement was, "You are never too small to make a difference." So each of us, regardless of our role, we can make a difference. So this is something that I would like to leave or share with you, and I hope you learned something with this presentation. And again, thank you and congratulations to your General Assembly. Mabuhay po kayong lahat.
Gusto niyo pong i-elaborate yung answer niyo kay Engineer Balisi?
Yes, so actually I've answered it on the chat, pero I don't have information kung meron ng ganung technology existing na. So hindi ko siya masagot directly. Pero what I know is that yung mga extreme weather events would really parang intensify in the coming years. So as I presented dun sa aking presentation, ang isang hindi natin ma-prevent talaga yung rise in temperature. So yung 1.5 degrees yun yung talagang reality na mangyayari. So maybe some of you who are not like familiar into yung issue ng climate change, but I would suggest strongly that you start reading literatures and also scientific papers around climate change. Kasi we're engineering-wise, malaki yung role natin as engineers in terms of yung present ko kanina, prevention, mitigation, and I think yung presentation ng Engineer Cañete kanina is really, really relevant kasi he really emphasized the importance of yung structural design, which is me as I am not practicing structural engineering. I don't do much in building designs, but in my work on disaster reduction and climate change, adaptation and mitigation, I work a lot with structural engineers, especially looking at the structural integrity and soundness of buildings. So I think my what I would share is that once you graduate, you will enter into different professions. Some of you might not enter into a structural design. Like me, I entered into environmental engineering, which is something that I really found I'm more interesting of. So every one of us, regardless of the profession that you will choose after you graduate, it all contributes to prevention, mitigation, and adaptation strategies. So I encourage everyone. I think my presentation was really, really compact and really short. But I mean, if you talk of climate change, extreme weather events, disasters, you cannot do it in an hour of discussion. It's really a long discussion. So I encourage you to read more, and I really, really advise you as engineers to really look into this issue of climate change. It's really a reality, and it's something that will affect us all. So yeah, I cannot see any more questions in the chat box, but in case you have more questions or follow-up concerns, I can continuously attend or answer your questions or requests. And if you wanted to know more about this topic, I can send you some reading materials links if you want. Just send me an email. And I do apologize for the quality of the recording. Hindi nyo naman kasi sinabi na pwede mag-live. Sana kung live to mas maayos. Oo, kasi I have troubles kasi of recording kasi pasensya na sa mga estudyante natin and dun sa mga fellow faculty po kasi the last week was really a hectic week for me. I've been making reports kasi in the last week. So, at saka may mga tinatapos po. So, medyo madaling araw ako. So, medyo may mga piyok ng konti sa presentation. Napansin pa ni
lang po
Sir
yan, sir.
Michael. I recorded that in the morning kasi. Pero prior to that, parang mga 3 o'clock na ako natulog. So, ayun. Pasensya na ginastify pa.
I have
Pero
a
yun.
question,
Yes,
Sir
sir.
Joe.
Yes, sir.
What is your advice for our students here in MLQU to be successful in their endeavors? Kung ano mang gusto nilang specialization after graduation.
I think one thing that I could share is never stop learning. I think that's the one thing. Never stop learning. Regardless of what profession you will choose, how, if I may say frankly, how boring your first job would be. Like me, I entered into construction. Actually, before I practice or before I entered into my current work now, I work in a huge construction company. So most of our projects are huge commercial centers or malls. So my work is on I was involved in quantity surveying and also construction management.
May naalala ko, Jojo.
Yes, I handle mostly precast engineering when I was on my first work, precast. Yan.
Nagba-vibrate masyado, no?
Yes. Oo. Alam mo yun, sir, may kwento naman yun eh. Yung isang project namin. Pero yun, I would share dun sa mga fellow students natin, never stop learning. Pero yung learning kasi, based on my experience also, for me, yung having yung mga higher degree like masters or PhD or doctorate would just be a part of that continuous learning. I really encourage you to practice, do field work, go to the communities, experience the work. Huwag kayong ma-stuck sa office. I would really encourage you. Like me, and when I started, aside from office work, I do like field work pro bono. So kumbaga parang para lang matuto ako, ma-experience ko. And then when I took environmental engineering, that gave me the opportunity to really go to field work. Actually, I visited a lot of places around the country, and you really see the reality of our community. So maybe another one is just maybe follow your passion. If you enjoy something, I think that's something that you will not enjoy your profession if you don't have passion. So I think that's something that maybe I could share also to everyone. So again, congratulations to your assembly.
Thank you very much, Sir Jojo.
Huwag kayong magsawang mag-invite. Thank you.
Hey sir, I have a question po.
Yes, sige.
Although hindi naman po siya related sa topic nyo, pero reading your your short bio, you graduated from MLQU.
Yes, so I graduated from MLQU.
Yes.
Kikwento ko pa ba yung history? Kami yung unang first batch na tinuruan ni Engineer Bailon. Yun, kami yung batch na yun. Okay.
So gano'n na po katanda si Sir Bailon.
Hindi naman. Pero wag kayong magpapaloko sa kanya pag sinabi niyang gagawa kayo ng gagawa kayo ng surveying at pag-apply niya ko sa isang lugar. Huwag kayong maniniwala. Ayun lang. Yun, first batch kami, yung existing pa ba yung building na yun sa Miquiapo?
Kaya po. Wala na yun.
Wala na, okay. Tagal ko na pala hindi nakapunta. So yun, dun kami, first batch kami ng tinuruan niya. Actually, yung batch namin, hindi ko talaga favorite subject ang anything about structural, yung theory of structure. It's a boring subject for me. Pero yung
yung taas na grade mo dun
na-enjoy ko lang yung doon ko lang nalaman na matalino pala ako sa theory. Pero yun, first batch kami ni Sir Bailon, and it was really, I think being in MLQU was one of the memorable, period of my being in university, college, in MLQU. Yun lang ang masasabi ko. And di ko makakalimutan yung Quiapo kasi nadukutan ako sa
Yun, sila yun.
Nabiktima kami dyan. So, glad na wala na kayo dyan sa area. Pang tuition ko pa yun. Sige, yun lang.
Nandiyan po ba si Dean?
Okay, so maybe call on Engineer Dante B. Potante to award the certificate.
I'll be reading the citations. Sige.
Yes, sir, yes.
The Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers, Manuel L. Quezon University Student Chapter present this certificate of appreciation to Engineer Jonathan Valdez for sharing for his valuable knowledge as a guest speaker of the General Assembly 2021 for disaster risk reduction with a lecture entitled Climate Change and Disaster Risk Reduction, awarded this January 16, 2021 via the Zoom meeting. Signed, President Raymond Francis M. Manalo, yours truly, Faculty Advisor, Dr. Michael Bailon, and our dearest Dean of the School of Engineering, Manuel L. Quezon University, Engineer Dante Potante. Let's give him a big hand po.
I'm very happy to know that Engineer Valdez is a Quezonian, Quezonian engineer.
Yeah.
I'm very thankful na nakaroon siya ng panahon, di ba? At naka-record pa pala yung kanyang talk. So, maganda. At sana pa nga sa mga susunod na pagkakataon, we can tap the other Quezonian engineers much better for our students really to know, that our Quezonian engineers are in motion. Ika nga, they are in practice. Congratulations and thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you po.
Baka ma-invite natin din dati maging lecturer din, no? Okay po. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sir Jojo.